Motion blur. Now, motion blur is a really cool technique in photography because you can use it as a kind of simplifying device and make your photos look a little bit more painterly. But it's not enough just to set your shutter speed to something low like 1 second or 2 seconds and expect to get something good. You have to kind of use motion blur in a deliberate sense, because if you're deliberate, then the message created by the motion blur is going to come across to the viewer. If you just have random motion blur, that's not going to be the case. So I'm going to talk about in this video 3 things or 3 ideas you can kind of use to make your motion blur more deliberate or use it in a more deliberate fashion. The first idea is non-uniform motion blur. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that with motion blur, it might be a good idea not to apply motion blur uniformly throughout the photo, but more to certain parts of a photo. Let me give you an example. This is a photo of a flower, and I took it with a long exposure, but you can see that in this photo, not all parts of it are equally blurry. And the reason why that is because I used a flash to freeze a sort of sharp ghost image of the photo, and it's superimposed upon a blurry part. So you see that in this photo, not all parts of the photo are equally motion blurred. There's a little bit of it that's sharp, so it creates a bit of a contrast. So it gives a nice painterly, blurry look, but it also has a little bit of a sharp part to provide contrast to that motion blur softness. Now, I did use a flash in that case, but you don't always have to use a flash. In fact, in the next photo of a red-winged blackbird, I have a general motion blur photo, no flash used, a long exposure again, and you can see that the entire bird is pretty much blurred, but you can see that the face looks a little bit different. And that's because in addition to the swaying of the branch, the bird also moved. So if some parts of your photo move more than others, then that motion blur effect is going to look different in the moving parts compared to the parts that are not moving. Or if one part is moving in a different way, then one part will look different than another part with the motion blur effect. And that's sort of another way to selectively apply motion blur to your photo. You can see that in the face, there's a very nice pattern of the bill. The red-winged blackbird moved its head back and forth, and you get a nice pattern on the face. And that extra little bit of detail, that extra pattern, provided a nice, cool anchor point where you can look and see some additional interest besides just the main motion blur. A very easy way to apply this technique is to use motion of your subject entirely again. Here is a shot of an American robin. You can see that this shot was taken with a long exposure, but there's a fairly clear outline of the bird. That's because the bird was perched still on the branch before it took off, and the bird starting to fly was recorded in the last little bit of the exposure. So you see that the contrast between the well-defined silhouette of the bird and the more dreamy movement of the bird gives the photo some interest. It's not a uniform blur. But selective motion blur or different effects applied to different parts of your photo don't just have to apply to movement. They can also apply to relative exposure values or relative brightness. So in this photo of a common gallinule, you have the water being much brighter than the bird, kind of disappeared much more quickly with the long exposure, and you see the silhouette of the bird. So in this case, the motion blur, the long exposure acted as a simplifying factor that allowed this photo to get a more simplified appearance with the water without much detail and the bird having a little bit more detail. So that variation in detail based on the motion blur shot is what gave this photo some interest. Another thing I want you to think about with motion blur is pattern. Pattern is so cool in photography. And if you have a pattern, sometimes motion blur can simplify that pattern, remove unnecessary detail. And if used in this way, motion blur does look very deliberate. Let's take a look at this photo of the seeds of a dandelion, still on a dandelion. And you can see that there's a nice pattern of the dandelion seeds in a sort of arrangement. And that arrangement was greatly simplified by motion blur because the small tendrils of the seeds and small other details were obliterated. Only the main forms of the seeds still exist. And plus, the seeds were moving in such a way so that you can really see certain positions in their movement clearer than others. Again, an uneven application of motion blur and the use of simplification in a pattern makes this photo look kind of nice. Let's take a look at a photo that combines these 2 techniques. Here's a photo of a raven. The raven was flying, and I panned with the subject. Panning is an excellent way to get patterns to appear in your photo and simplify the background. If I didn't pan or use a long exposure, this raven would have been behind a bunch of leaves of trees, and it would have been a little bit more obscured. Yet, because the raven was relatively in the same position for the whole exposure, you can still see the form of the raven relatively well, and yet the background has been turned into a nice smooth pattern. The final idea I want to talk about with regard to motion blur is distortion. Sometimes motion blur can distort your subject so that it looks a little different than it would have looked if you didn't use motion blur. Here's an example of a red-winged blackbird. This photo was, again, taken with a long exposure, and you can see that the face, because it was a little bit blurred by the long exposure, looks a little bit unusual. The bill almost takes on the look of a smile, and as a result, the face looks a little bit creepy. That slightly creepy look of the red-winged blackbird gives it a very interesting feel that you would just simply not get if you took a regular old sharp shot. So just to recap, we have 3 ideas here. The first idea is to use motion blur unequally in your photo to sort of give a bit of a contrast and deliberation to your photo. The second idea is to use motion blur to simplify or bring out patterns that otherwise would be a little bit overcomplicated by unnecessary details. And the third idea is to use motion blur for distortion. Make your subject look a little unusual, ethereal, otherworldly with the motion blur. That's it. Those are my 3 ideas for motion blur. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you again next time.